Hello, everyone, and welcome to Amended Returns in Drake Software. This webcast is brought to you by CPA Practice Advisor and Drake Software. I'm Gail Perry, Editor-in-Chief of CPA Practice Advisor, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to explain how continuing education credit for this webcast works. The webcast qualifies for 1 credit of CPE, and also, if you need it, 1 IRS CE credit. If you plan to earn credit for attending this session, you must stay with us for at least 50 minutes. And if you plan to earn IRS CE credit for this session, you can, at any time during the hour-long event, you can enter your PTIN number in the Ask a Question box on your screen, and we'll record it there. In addition, we'll display 4 polling questions during the webcast. You'll need to record an answer for at least 3 of the questions, as this is our verification that you are still watching. Later today, you'll receive an email from CPA Practice Advisor that contains a link to your CPE certificate, assuming you met the requirements for CPE. Also, if you're needing IRS CE credit and you've entered your PTIN number, we will be submitting those to the IRS later this week. So please note that we can give continuing education credit for multiple people watching on the same computer. So if there are others in your office who would like to attend this event at the same computer, please have them join you now. And at the end of the event, we'll provide an opportunity for you to send us their email addresses so that they too can receive credit. At any time, you can enter any questions you might have in the Ask a Question box provided on your screen. Our speaker will try to get to as many questions as possible during the presentation. Questions not answered during this live webinar will be addressed by our speaker afterwards via email. Today, we're joined by Amanda Watson, Onboarding and Retention Manager at Drake Software. And now, Amanda, we're ready to begin.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you for everyone joining us today. I am really happy to present this session today on amended returns. So I think we should just get started. I think the first thing that we want to establish when talking about amended returns is to start with some good definitions for us. And here I have that on the next slide for you. And I want to talk about in the context of an amended return and a superseded return, because there are it is a little confusing, and rightfully so. So first, let's start with an amended return. An amended return is just a return that, and I should back up and say, today we're talking about amended returns in the context of individual tax filers, individual returns, 1040s. Again, amended return is a corrected return that is filed after the originally filed return, but it is filed after the expiration date of the filing period. So after filing season is over, or not, I shouldn't say filing season, after the due date of the return, if a correction is needed, an amended return would be filed. Now, a superseded return is much like an amended return. And the one thing that makes it a little bit differently is the timing of which it is filed. So a superseded return is, again, a corrected return that is filed after the originally filed return, but is submitted before the due date. And so they are a little bit confusing because they're almost words that are used interchangeably, but still necessary. I've had people ask me, why do I need to file a superseded return rather than an amended return? And generally, there's not a lot of difference. However, there may be cases where an election must be made before the due date of the return. And in that case, if that election is needed to be made on a corrected or a 1040X, that would need to be filed on a superseded return. So that would be before the due date of the return. So that would be filed then. So, when we think about amended returns, there's going to be a lot of reasons why people need to correct returns. And there could be various reasons. And I've talked to a lot of tax professionals over the years, and there are some main categories of reasons why tax professionals need to work with amended returns. Sometimes it is to make an election after the deadline. And again, that would be an amended return. Then you may need to change amounts that the IRS previously adjusted, or simply just to make a correction. And making that correction can be, the result of many problems or issues, including the taxpayer themselves filed, did the return on their own, a self-prepared return, and made a mistake. And now they have sought out some help from a tax professional who, needing to correct that. Sometimes, and it's very rare that a tax professional would make a mistake, but in some cases, a mistake may be made and that would need to be corrected. One of the most common reasons I see that a superseded or amended return would need to be filed is that the taxpayer has forgotten to bring or have omitted certain source documents or certain documentation from the return. For example, you may have someone, you've prepared the return, it's been e-filed, accepted, and then they come back later and said, oh, I forgot to give you this 1099 or this W-2 or this K-1, or I forgot to have you deduct this. So in many cases, I think that's probably one of the most common reasons for that, for an amended or superseded return. So before we dive in and talk about it a little more, we are going to pause for our first poll question.
Okay, this is our first of 4 polling questions, and the question is, what is the most common reason that you file amended or superseded returns for your clients? And the options are: the customer forgot the source document or other information, I'm correcting a return prepared by someone else, I'm correcting an error that I made, changes to the tax laws or rules, or none of the above. So please pick the answer that seems most appropriate for your situations where you have opportunities to file amended or superseded returns. And
Great.
again, while we're doing that, just a real quick reminder, if you need CPE credit or CE credit from the IRS for this, please go ahead and enter your PTIN number in the Ask a Question box on your screen.
Great. Thank you for that, Gail. As I'm looking at the responses coming in, I'm seeing between 75 and 80% of you letting us know that the customer or client forgot some type of source document or information. So that seems to check out pretty well, that it generally is the result of something being omitted from the original filing. All right. Continuing on, both superseded and amended returns are filed on Form 1040-X for individuals. And that, again, I think adds to the confusion to make the differentiation between the two, because both being filed on the same form, sometimes they may look identical. And generally, it is the time in which they are filed that makes the difference. That superseded return, though, filed before the due date of the return, is really intended to supersede or replace that that original return. And an amended just would be after the due date. And the IRS treats both of them very similarly, but the 1040-X is used to amend returns for the 1040 series of returns, which includes the 1040, the 1040 SR for seniors, the 1040 NR. It can also be used to amend returns filed on the 1040 SS or the 1040 PR. I know in the last tax year, the IRS made some changes to that, but you can use the 1040-X to file amended returns for prior year returns as well. So it does include all of those items. Now, when we think about a little bit about e-filing the 1040-X, one thing that we see is that the 1040-X, sometimes we encounter preparers who forget to go ahead and file the 1040-X, but the 1040 hasn't been filed. Hopefully, you would know that the 1040-X must be filed after the 1040 has been filed. And if you have a case where the 1040 has been, let's say, paper filed, and you just mailed it last week, and now you've realized there needs to be an amended return filed, you may want to wait until that 1040 has been received and processed. With e-filing, of course, that does speed up the process, but the 1040X does need to be filed. And if you have paper filed the original 1040, make sure and give plenty of time for that to be processed. If there is a credit or refund due to the taxpayer, the 1040X should be filed within 3 years of the timely filed original return, or 2 years after the tax is paid, whichever is later. If it's a balance due return, I believe the IRS wants you to send that in at any time. Well, the thing about a 1040X is the processing time. There are some considerable processing times for Form 1040X for both amended and superseded returns. You can go to the IRS website, irs.gov, and they have an estimate of the processing time, and it does vary depending on what page you're reading it on, but the IRS has a great page that lets you know where they are in processing. So today, for example, I took a look at that this morning, and for 1040s, the IRS is still processing 1040s that they received in December 2024. But for 1040X, they're still processing 1040X returns that they received in July of 2024. So there is a considerable delay, or I guess delay may not be the word, a large processing time needed for that 1040X. And right here on the screen, I have 16 to 20 weeks, and it could be a little shorter or a little longer. It looks like it's almost 6 months at this point, but sometimes we see that they have caught up on the backlog a little bit, and it can be a little bit less, sometimes a little more. And so one of the ways that you as a tax professional can speed up the processing time for these types of returns is to e-file them. And you can e-file them now. If you've been in the tax industry for several years, you may remember prior to 2020, you could not e-file an amended return, which added to the processing time. And of course, that would be the time to put it in the mail and mail that in. And then in 2020, I'm sure that many of you probably remember that well, that is when we had the COVID-19 pandemic, and the IRS virtually shut down and sent all their employees home. And we heard all of these stories about mail sitting on trucks just waiting to be processed. And during 2020, the IRS decided that it was a good time to begin e-filing these amended returns. I'm sure it was in the works long before this, but it really couldn't have come at a better time. So beginning in the summer of 2020, the IRS, and as a matter of fact, at Drake Software, we worked closely with the IRS to have, we launched a little bit before it was officially open to do some test e-file through Drake for the 2019 returns that needed to be amended. So in the summer of 2020, I believe it was August, the IRS began accepting amended returns, but there were a lot of restrictions on what you could e-file. So they started off with a smaller number of what could be e-filed. So back in 2020, and this was only for 2019 returns, the IRS said in order to e-file the original return must have been e-filed too. They said there's no direct deposit if the taxpayer is due a refund. He or she must wait for a paper check from the IRS. They also had some restrictions in place for the number of times a 1040X could be e-filed for a single taxpayer, and that was 3. So you could file the 1040X electronically 3 times. Any subsequent needs to amend that would have to be mailed in. They also said right now when we open the e-file for 1040X, you are not allowed to change the filing status or the taxpayer ID, which is in most cases a social security number. So that was not something that you could change through e-file of a 1040X. And so we continued with this e-file, these rules in place from August through the end of 2020 for 2019 returns, and actually into the whole entire next year. So at the beginning of 2022, when we were ready to file 2021 returns, the IRS lifted some of those restrictions for us. And I like to walk through these stages of what happened, of how the IRS continued to broaden what they could accept electronically, because sometimes you may remember a restriction that was in place and it may not be there. So it kind of helps like walk through that. Oh, yes, I remember that restriction, but it's been lifted. So beginning of calendar year 2022, the IRS says, okay, now you can e-file the amendment even if the original return wasn't e-filed. So if the original return was paper filed, you can now e-file that and we won't reject it. But you should definitely wait until the paper return has had time to process, because you wouldn't want the 1040X to get there before the 1040. They also said we can now change the filing status on a return by filing a 1040X electronically. And you can now change the primary or secondary Social Security number on the 1040X by e-file. And then we saw our last batch of changes come into place that are still in place now, beginning in filing season 2023, which is almost 2 years ago. It's kind of crazy to believe that it's already 2025. But they said, okay, now you can use the 1040X to electronically file and have the refund directly deposited into the taxpayer's account. Now, this is only eligible for e-filed 1040Xs. If you need to mail in a 1040X, from everything that I know is that you have to have a paper check for those refunds due. And the IRS also stipulated that they would begin accepting superseded returns by e-file for the 2023 tax season. So all of that to say, some of those initial restrictions are still in place, including the number of times that you can send a return through. So that is still in place. For each 1040X per tax year, you can only transmit 3 electronically. So if you have a taxpayer who needs to send through a 4th 1040X, that 4th and any subsequent 1040Xs would need to be mailed in. And talking about superseded returns are included in that count. When I said that you're only allowed to amend a return 3 times electronically, superseded returns are included in that count. So it's any combination of superseded returns and amended returns. Basically, the IRS says you can only file Form 1040X 3 times electronically per taxpayer per tax year. Because they are filed in the same form, when the IRS receives them, they look a lot alike electronically. Okay, let's see. Alrighty, I was looking at some of your questions. I see one here from Jeffrey. Can you file a superseded return for the 1040? Yes, you can. I think we already talked about that one. Great. And let's see, what is the impact of superseded returns on the impact of the statute of limitations? Well, again, the superseded returns are filed before the due date of the return. And it is a good way to make those elections that are due by the due date of the return or must be made by then. And every election is a little different, but sometimes you can use superseded to do that. Otherwise, there may not be a reason to do it quickly, but if it's, let's say, March and you filed a 1040 and there was an election that you forgot to make, you may want to try to file that 1040X before the due date of that return, which we would assume would be April 15th. So you'd want to get that in before that, so it would supersede that way. Okay, and I think that this is a great opportunity at this place in our presentation to go to our second poll question.
Okay, everyone, here is the second poll question for this webinar. Have you ever e-filed an amended or superseded return? In your answer options are yes, no, or unsure. And by the way, if you have any trouble answering the questions online, sometimes depending on the device you're using, these questions don't pop up properly. You can always enter your answer to any of the polling questions in that Ask a Question box on your screen, and we'll record it there.
Great. Thanks, Gail. When I'm looking at the results still coming in, it looks like over 90% of you had e-filed an amended return or superseded return, which is great. I think it's a fantastic way to serve our customers well by at least speeding up the process of getting that information to the IRS. As you're finishing up your poll question, I see some additional questions come in, and I have one here that I just wanted to clarify. Harry says, superseded goes on a different return than the 1040X. And no, that's not the case. The superseded return is filed on Form 1040X. And if you've ever examined Form 1040X very closely, you'll notice that it doesn't necessarily, there's not a checkbox to say amended or superseded. Like if you were looking at it, on a piece of paper or a PDF, there's not an indicator there. Really, the timestamp would help with that indication when the IRS receives it. And we'll look at how these are implemented in Drake software in just a few minutes. But we do have an option to have superseded printed at the top of the form because the IRS really doesn't provide any kind of indicator on the 1040X to indicate whether it's superseded or amended. And that's okay if you don't. Okay, I have some other questions. Second time amending, do you amend the First Amendment or the original? That's a great question. When you amend a return, it does change the 1040. So if you're amending for a second time, you would want to amend the most recent version of the return filed, which would be the amended returns. And then someone says, can I assume that interest and penalties may apply to amended returns, but not superseded returns? Norman, I think that's pretty accurate assumption there. I mean, I never want to use the word never or always when we're talking about tax, but generally if it's filed before the due date, you may not have failure to file penalties. There could be other interest and penalties that may occur for other reasons, but I think you mean like as far as failure to file penalties. I'm sure there could be underpayment penalties and all kinds of other things. So generally, I think we're on the same page there. If someone already filed your taxpayer Social Security number for the tax year, do you have to file an amended return or file a regular return by mail? Well, Patricia, that's a good question. If someone else already filed your taxpayer's return, it depends on a couple of variables. Did they file the return legitimately? Like, did your taxpayer prepare it themselves or have another tax professional file that return, or was it fraud? So I think that the answer to that question really depends on the situation. When you said file with their Social Security number, it really, to me, I think indicates that they weren't someone did it nefariously. And in that case, you wouldn't file a 1040X, but it probably would need to be paper filed. Or you may be able to use one of those imperfect return elections, depending on that. And you know what I've heard this year, that even if the return is rejected, if you have an IP pin, if it's rejected because someone else has filed your return, if you have an IP pin, you may still be able to e-file, but it goes into some type of exception processing. Don't quote me on that, but I think I remember to do that. And someone asked, how do you get superseded on the top of Form 1040X? I'm going to show you how to do that in Drake in just a little bit. All right, some things to know about amended returns. Like, because of the longer processing time, you may find yourself, well, your taxpayer may find themselves wondering what's happening. And if your taxpayer or your client is wondering what's happening, they're probably asking you. So one really great tip that I have when it comes to filing these types of returns is really to manage your taxpayers or your clients' expectations by letting them know upfront how long they should expect this amended return to be processed. Like I said earlier, right now the IRS is still working on returns that were filed in July. So you should definitely under promise and over deliver, maybe even tell them a little bit longer than it's taking so they don't get a little, a little bit impatient. If you have mailed in a 1040X, you can use a tool called Where's My Amended Return? And I should say if you've mailed or e-filed. But if you've mailed the return, it can take up to 3 weeks to show in this tool. And I have a link on the screen that goes right to that tool, but it's really easy to find without having to write down that URL. You can just Google it. Where's my amended return? You can go to irs.gov and search where's my amended return. And it's a tool a lot like where's my return or where's my refund, where you can plug in some key information about a tax return and it will tell you the status. Of course, this tool, just like Where's My Refund, was meant for taxpayers to use. Just a little asterisk there. If you have e-filed, it could still take up to a week, maybe a week and a half to 2 weeks to show in the tool. And if you have filed a return and it's not there immediately, I would recommend being patient. And it will show you the status of what's happening. There's some cases that this tool is not available. It's not available if you're filing an amended return for carrybacks, applications or claims, injured spouse claims. If you're just filing a 1040 that's been marked, corrected, or amended somehow, that will not show here, only 1040Xs. If you have an amended return with a foreign address, it will not show in this tool. If it's an amended business tax return, this tool only shows individual returns, so not business returns. And if it is an amended return that's being processed by a specialized unit, such as examination or the bankruptcy department, it shouldn't show here either. And one thing that I didn't mention, and I think I should, is that not only can you e-file 1040Xs for the current tax year, you can also e-file the 2 prior tax years. So you can e-file those for 2 prior years. It follows the same cadence as a regular 1040. So for regular 1040s, you can do the current plus 2 prior. But the Where's My Amended Return refund tool will show you up to 3 years prior, even if you paper file, that 3rd prior year. So again, you can e-file prior year amended returns. And let's see, I have a question here from Michael. Can you amend a superseded return if it was filed in error? Yes, Michael, you can amend a superseded return. They're both going to be filed on Form 1040X. You can correct a corrected return as many times as needed, but only electronically 3 times. Okay, for acts, acknowledgments, is there any difference between superseded and amendments? No, they will both come through as 1040X. As far as e-filing, they're both going to look really similar to the IRS. And when you e-file, that is done in an XML file. And that's just what happens behind the scenes. And generally, there's not an indicator there that indicates whether it's superseded or amended in the XML file. It just is the timing when it's filed. So the IRS doesn't make a huge differentiation there, but there is some, of course. But as far as electronically filing, it isn't a big difference. All right, so let's talk about some best practices for amended returns, because when you're working with amended returns, there's a lot of questions and there's a lot of different ways. You probably all work in a little bit different ways, but one of the best places to start, if you have a taxpayer comes in that wants an amended return, what is the best course of action? Well, the first thing you should do is try to obtain a copy of the originally filed return or the last filed 1040X. And if the taxpayer is unable to provide that, I recommend trying to get a transcript of the original return. And the IRS has a great tool. It's called the Tax Pro account. And hopefully, most of you have heard of that. You can create an account online and it really speeds up for these type of requests for the transcript or power of attorney request. So you can go into your Tax Pro account. I recommend everyone making one. And then your taxpayer can go into their account and grant you access to 8821s, power of attorneys. So that's an easy way to get a transcript of a return. But bottom line, you want to know what was filed originally if you didn't file the return. If you filed the return, you likely have that. And that goes to the point number 2, is to save hard copies of the original return. And I recommend a PDF. When you file a return, it's really important to keep a copy of those returns on file. And you need a hard copy. Some of you may operate still with paper. And to be honest, I love paper because it's just how things have worked. It's very concrete for me. But I also love PDFs. And either way that you choose to save your hard copies of the original return is okay. But I recommend a PDF or a paper copy. That way you know exactly what was filed. And I talk to preparers a lot who don't do this. They don't save a PDF copy of the return, nor do they save a printed out paper copy. They just leave the return in their software. For example, in Drake software, your data file is there, but every time you go and view your return or view the pages, we're going to recalculate it with any changes that may have made, whether there was a stray data entry mark, an intentional data entry field changed, or there was a change in the tax law. And I know that you may have experience, especially some states do make retroactive changes. And so if a retroactive change is made or any change has been made since that return was last calculated, updating or recalculating the return may change the results. So I generally recommend always saving a PDF copy. And in Drake, it's really simple to do because it's all connected to our document manager if you use that system. But that's a great thing because you want to know what was sent to the IRS. And yeah, that's another tip. And that brings me to archive your software data file. And in Drake Tax, and I'll show you this in just a minute, we have a tool that helps you archive your software data file, which means it takes a snapshot of your data entry screens exactly at that moment in time when your return is e-filed. So that if you do inadvertently or deliberately make a change after the return is e-filed, you can go back to that pristine version that was e-filed. And if you don't use Drake or you're not familiar with the archive tool, having a backup of that data file is a great alternative to that. It's really the same thing. Having that return in the state that it was e-filed is really important in case you need to make changes later. And I mentioned this earlier about managing the taxpayer expectations. The last thing that you want is to have your taxpayer be impatient because they expect their amended return, especially if they're getting a refund, to come through very quickly. And as we have learned today, these returns are not processed quickly on the IRS end. So letting your customer know ahead of time that, look, this is going to take 6 months perhaps, or how many ever weeks you can go to the IRS website to do that. I think that's a really good way to serve your customers well, is by letting them know what to expect. Also providing them the link to the Where's My Refund tool as another great way to serve people well, so they can have transparency themselves into what is happening at the IRS. I know that the IRS is a little bit intimidating sometimes for taxpayers, and having the ability to see that information may be helpful. You may have taxpayers who want you to do it all for them, and that's okay too, but it could help. And then lastly, one thing that I always recommend is that you charge for your time, and not just in the context of amended returns, but just in general. as a tax professional, you offer a valuable service to the American taxpayer. And it is through education that you've spent your time investing in education and learning and CPE, CE credits. And all the time that you've poured into learning this, that is valuable. And you can help taxpayers navigate that. And I recommend charging for these amended returns, especially if it is something like the taxpayer forgot something. And I know some of you may like to file those amended returns as a complimentary service, but I do encourage you to charge your worth and charge for your expertise, charge for your service. So I think that's really important. And I think that this is a great time for poll question number 3. So would you help us out with that, Gail?
Certainly. That was an excellent segue into poll question number 3, which is, do you charge an additional fee to prepare an amended return? And your answer options are yes, no, or it depends on the circumstances. So it should be interesting to see these results.
Yes. And you know what? It may depend on the circumstances. If it was an error on the part of the preparer, maybe they would wish to not charge for that. But generally, I think yes is probably what most people would do. And maybe no, maybe your business model, you have an all-inclusive type pricing model. And that is what is so interesting about this industry is everybody's business is vastly different and their revenue and their business model varies a lot. So it's really interesting to hear. So far, Gail, it looks like about 53% of the people say they do charge for amended returns. About 45% say it depends on the circumstance, which that makes sense. And a very small percent of you say, no, you do not charge. So very interesting indeed. And before we, I want to hop into Drake and show you a few things, but I see we have a lot of questions coming in. So I want to take a look at some of them and see if I can answer those. Let's see. Okay, Mary Valerie says, wouldn't it be nice to make a duplicate copy of return before making changes without archiving or making a backup copy? With an archive or backup, you can't look at both in Drake software. Mary Valerie, we're going to look at that in just a moment. Then we do have a tool where you can toggle between versions of the return. You can't look at them side by side at the same time, but you can toggle back and forth. You can, of course, look at them at the same time if you're looking at a PDF or a hard copy. Does Drake support e-filing a return of an earlier year in the tax software of that year? Norman, Drake software supports e-filing everything the IRS allows. And so the IRS says you can e-file the current year and 2 prior. However, to e-file, let's say, a 2023 return, you would need to open the 2023 tax software. And the reason for that is because the tax code is different every year, and you wouldn't want to prepare or calculate that 23 return in Drake 24 because the forms are different, the tax calculations are different. So you do need to open the tax software that corresponds to that specific tax year to file those prior year returns. Okay, there are some more questions, but I want to hop into the software and maybe I'll be able to answer some of these questions and then we'll look at that. So what I'm going to do is I am going to share my screen very quickly here. Let's see, right here. And I'm going to share my entire screen right here. And I'm going to, oh, you see my background. And right now I have Drake 24 pulled up on my screen. Hopefully you all can see that. It looks like it's coming through just fine. So here is the home screen of Drake Tax 2024. And I have a few returns that have already been entered into my software. Actually, these are the test returns that are installed with Drake. So these are all bogus returns. It's not any live tax data. So here on the home screen, you can see that I have a return here that is indicated that it has been accepted by the IRS. So let's work with this return here to like walk through the steps of amending this return. So this is a 1040 return. It's actually a married filing joint return. Before I open it, I do have this warning that lets me know that this return has been electronically filed and accepted by the IRS, and changes should only be made if I want to amend a return. And that's exactly what I'm doing. So do I wish to continue? Yes. So after that, it opens up the return into what we are accustomed to seeing in Drake. This is the data entry menu. And from the data entry menu, the first thing I want to do is I want to prepare the 1040X first before I make any changes whatsoever. So in order to do that, I need to open the screen that's associated with it. I've used Drake for a really long time, so I really like to navigate using the selector field. So for me, I would just type in X for 1040X, or you could actually type in 1040X, press enter, and it will, whoops, I just want to do X. I had to put a colon there. Excuse me, a hyphen, and it will open the screen. But let me just back out of here for a second and show you another way to access that screen. You can use these tabs at the top to toggle among different categories of entry screens. And the Other Forms tab has other types of forms, including extensions and this 1040X. So you can find it this way. I find it much easier just to type in X, and it will open the screen. Here is the screen for 1040X. What you want to do on the screen is fill it in with the amounts from the original return. And we make it really simple. We have a notification here, automatically archive return and fill screen. So not only are we going to automatically fill this screen with the original amounts, we're going to create an archive behind the scenes of this return so we can always flip back to that original return. So I'm going to click yes here, and that's what I recommend. So immediately you'll notice that we filled in all of these amounts. These were all overrides, if you will, and those are the original amounts. So I don't really need to do anything else on this screen except one thing, and that is the explanation of changes. That is something required for the IRS, so you're going to type in something really nice and eloquent here. I'm just going to use something very simple for our demo today. If you want to indicate that it's a superseded return, you can check this box here. If you want to print superseded on the front of the return, you can check this box here. I think that's one of the questions we had earlier. So that's really everything we need to do here. So I want to also, before we exit the screen, point out that there's a video at the top of the screen, and we have these links strategically embedded on different screens in Drake. So if you're on this screen, you're like, oh, I don't remember how to do this, you can click this and see a short 1 to 3 minute video walking you through the steps. But this is all I want to do for the screen. So I'm going to close the screen and go back to the data entry menu. And from this point forward, I'm going to go into screens and make the changes that we need for this return. And I am going to I'm not going to actually add a W-2. Well, I will add a W-2. I'm going to add a W-2 here, and I'm just going to do something really quickly. You would, of course, use accuracy to enter this just like you would for any data entry screen that you use. I'm just typing in something here. All right, I don't have a state return on this return, so I'm going to then hit Control V, which calculates the return and takes me to view mode so I can see the results of my work here. So because I hit Control V from the W-2 screen, it takes me to the W-2. But now in view mode, you can see that I now have a 1040X that is prepared, and it shows the original amounts, the net change, and the corrected amounts. So when I e-file, it not only will send everything that needs to go, which would include the 1040X and any of the original 1040 that would be sent to. We could also see that there may be a voucher that is created I don't know what change I made. I had a difference on the return. I just entered random numbers. It does create the quarterly statements. I'm sure that was there before. But you can see here that I have some red message pages that indicate that I have some problems. So I didn't complete my data entry. So I want to go back and just do a few more things so the program knows I actually want to e-file the 1040X. So one thing to remember, each time you e-file 1040X, you must have the taxpayer sign a new 8879. So I need to come back to the PIN screen, and here on the screen, you can see the PIN entries from the original return. So I'd want to update that with today's date, which mine is already set to that, and then indicate that this is for 1040X. This PIN is for the 1040X. If there is a direct debit, any of this, I don't think we have that on a 1040X. We would check that. Additionally, on the EF selection screen, you would need to come to the screen and indicate that you want to send a 1040X/superseded return. If it is the second one or third one, you would check that one appropriately. And I haven't really addressed state returns at this point because every state's a little different. So we have really been thinking about just the federal returns, but you may find yourself needing to amend a state return. And if that's the case, before you make changes, I recommend going into the state return and doing the equivalent of the X screen for that state, and then make changes from there. So from there, we're ready to e-file. I don't think I have any more error messages. I just picked a random return. But yes, I have a green check mark right here that lets me know that I'm ready to e-file. So of course, at this point, I would make sure that the taxpayer has provided the new 8867 and has signed that. And then I would e-file this just as a regular return. And in Drake software, you do have the ability to set up, we call it the 9325 notice, where it would send the taxpayer an email when the return has been accepted. So that works for 1040X as well. So you can go to setup and then choose options. And I know that we're going through this pretty quickly, but I just want to get you familiar with the things that you can do. And we have lots of great documentation to show you how to do it. So this option here, email 9325 notice to taxpayer, if that's checked, and you have an email address entered for the taxpayer, when the return is accepted, there will be an automatic email sent from the Drake Processing Center to your taxpayer letting them know the return has been accepted. So that is something that you could set up for 1040X as well. So with that, I want to take a look at it and see if we have any very specific software questions. We have just another few minutes here. Let's see, some questions right here. Let's see. Does it say superseded at the top of the return? I'm not sure that I checked that. I think I left it unchecked. But one thing I do want to show you, let's take a look and see if I check that. I didn't check that, but I can check that. I hit Control V to go to view mode. V is in view. And yes, Janet asked that question, V is in view. There is some alternative keys if you want to use Control V for paste, which I would normally do, but it's just been around longer than the PC. The 1040X would now say, I'm not sure. I think because I already did that. Maybe it doesn't say superseded here. I don't know. I must have not have done that correctly. Nevertheless, I wanted to spend a little bit of time showing you the archive manager because I just kind of breezed over that. In view mode, there is an archive manager here. And because we used the archive manager on the X screen, you can see I have a copy of the return, which is the federal return, the original before amending. I also have a version that was selected when I e-filed the original return, which was this morning. So here I can, if I wanted to flip back to this one, I would click restore. And what happens, it says, hey, before you restore it, do you want to create an archive of what you have now? Which I think is a great idea. So I say yes, and I'm going to put 1040X so I can always flip back to that return. and it creates this archive automatically for us. And so now I have that version, and now I've gone back to the version before amending. So if you ever need to go back or you made a mistake, you can always go back to the amended return before, the return before amending. So you can see now I only have 2 W-2s because we're back to that original return. So just to recap, and I know that was pretty quick, in from view mode, you can access this archive manager from the documents menu. In archive manager, you can create as many archives as you want and flip between different versions of the return. So with that, I think that we need to head back to our presentation just to take in our fourth poll question so that we can be sure and get those in for you so you can get your CE credits.
All right, thanks, Amanda. So the fourth poll question for this event, remember you needed to answer 3 questions to make sure that you qualify for the credit. The fourth question is, are you a Drake software customer? And your answer options are yes, no, or other. So choose whichever one is most appropriate to you. And then we'll bump this back to Amanda for her closing comment.
Thank you, Gail. I really appreciate that. It looks like most of you are Drake software customers, which that's pretty exciting. While you're finishing up, I have a few questions here. I know that there's a lot that I haven't been able to address, but hopefully we can look at a few now. Does Drake only allow up to 3 years prior to e-file a 1040X? That's from Doris. And Doris, the IRS is actually the one that has the restrictions on that, and it is the current plus 2 prior for e-file. So Drake does allow whatever the IRS does, and that's for the 1040X as well as any other return types. Like the 1040, you can file current plus 2 priors. So it is 2 prior plus current. So it's a total of 3, but only 2 prior. Okay, if the return is rejected for any reason, does the taxpayer receive a 9325 notice about the rejection? Ramona, no, we will not email a rejection notice to the taxpayer. We're going to let you as the tax professional manage that rejection. Hopefully it's something that you can correct quickly. Cynthia asked, can you archive all your returns at once? Unfortunately, no. And you probably wouldn't want to because you're probably at different states of that return, like taxpayer A may be complete, taxpayer B may be mid course. But the good news is that when you select a return for e-file, Drake is going to automatically archive that return for you. So you'll always have that when it's selected for e-file. And the reason we do that because we know it's important for you to know exactly what's being e-filed. And we think it's really important for you to have a copy of that when we consider that you're probably finished with the return. Yep, so there's that question. Let's see what else. I've been charging $175 for the first hour and then $150 per. Oh, well, that was Harry asking about specific pricing. And I didn't realize that when I read it. But Harry, I can't really tell you what to charge. And that would be based on several things, depending on your market, your clientele, your location, and everybody's model is going to be a little different. So unfortunately, I have no advice there. Okay, let's see. Some of these are, does Drake offer guidelines for pricing tax? No, so unfortunately, we don't. There's a lot of legal considerations when thinking about providing pricing models. So it's something that we don't do. Okay. This is some of these I may not be able to answer in the context of this presentation. The ASCPA says superseded returns are not amended returns, so how can it be filed on an amended 1040X since it needs to be considered an original return and thus must be distinguished from an amended return? Stephen, I'm not sure about the ASCPA's position, but I do know that the superseded and amended returns are both filed on Form 1040X. and that is how they're transmitted to the IRS. And if you prepared one, they would both be on the 1040X, which would have the prior return, which generally is the original numbers, and I don't think it's necessarily considered the original return. It is both on 1040X. I do know that. And there's some other questions here that are very, very specific that I may not be able to address, but there's one that says, does the return that Drake auto archives when e-file happens only to the pages that actually go to the IRS? Stan, that's a good question. We're not archiving necessarily the PDF of the forms, but we're archiving the data entry screens, like the data file, so you can flip back and forth. So it has all of your entries in the archive. Yep. And I think that kind of wraps us up here today, Gail. And I think that we've had a lot of great interaction today. So I think that's it for us.
Okay. Thank you so much, Amanda. This has been great. And any questions that didn't get answered, or as Amanda mentioned, some were kind of specific, they'll all be sent to Amanda. So she can answer them by email, but we apologize we couldn't get to every single question online today. But we want to thank you all for your time today and sharing your engagement and participation with all the questions that came in. That was great. We want to thank Drake for making this event possible and for enabling us to offer a free CPE and CE credit to each attendee. As a reminder, you'll receive a link to your CPE certificate later today in the mail, in your email. It'll be an email from CPA Practice Advisor. CE credits will be directly submitted to the IRS. If you have any questions about CPE or CE credits, you can contact me directly at gperry, G-P-E-R-R-Y, at cpapracticeadvisor.com. Also, if others are watching this event with you at the same computer and they require continuing education credit, you can email me their names and email addresses, and we'll take care of that. Again, it's gperry at cpapracticeadvisor.com. Right after this event, you're going to be presented with a post-event survey evaluation form. We hope you'll take a moment to fill that out so that we can continue to improve our webinar series. Again, thank you all. Thank you, Drake. Thank you, Amanda, for sharing your time with us today. And I think that is it. Our audio is going to stop now.